Imagine being 3 years old and watching your brother being carried away from you. Imagine reaching out your little hands and screaming his name while strangers put him in a car and drive away. Now imagine spending the next 60 years of your life wondering where he went, if he was alive, if he ever thought about you, if he even knew you existed. That was the reality for 63-year-old Willie Ray Jenkins, a retired postal worker from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who stepped onto the Family Feud stage carrying a secret so heavy it had shaped every single day of his life. And when Steve Harvey learned the truth, he did not just get emotional. He broke down. The man who has made a career out of making people laugh stood on his own stage and wept like a child, because what happened that day was not a game show moment. It was 60 years of injustice being corrected in a single, shattering minute. If you are new to this channel, let me tell you something. We do not do ordinary stories here. We do the kind of stories that change the way you see the world. So hit that subscribe button right now and tap that bell, because what you are about to hear is something you will never forget. I promise you that. Willie Ray Jenkins was born in 1961 in a small town called Udall, Alabama, about 30 miles southwest of Tuscaloosa. His mother, Bessie Mee Jenkins, was 22 years old when she had Willie Ray. She already had one other son, a boy named George Edward, who was 3 years older than Willie Ray. George Edward was born in 1958. The boys had different fathers, neither of whom was in the picture. Bessie Mee raised them alone in a shotgun house with a tin roof and no running water. She worked picking cotton during the season and cleaned houses the rest of the year. She was poor in a way that most people in modern America cannot imagine. But she loved those two boys. By every account from every person who knew her, Bessie Mee Jenkins loved her sons with a ferocity that poverty could not touch. Then the state of Alabama got involved. In 1964, when Willie Ray was 3 and George Edward was 6, a social worker visited Bessie Mee's home. The report she filed described the house as unfit for children. No electricity, no plumbing, food was scarce. Bessie Mee was doing her best, but her best was not enough for the standards of 1960s Alabama, which is a bitter irony given what the state itself was doing to black families at that time. The social worker recommended that both boys be removed from the home. Bessie Mee fought it. She begged. She went to her pastor. She went to the one lawyer in town who had talked to a black woman in 1964, and he told her there was nothing he could do. The system had decided. The boys were going. But here is the part that makes this story different from every other foster care separation story you have ever heard. George Edward and Willie Ray were not just separated from their mother. They were separated from each other, and it was not an accident. It was a deliberate decision. George Edward, the older boy, was placed with a black family in Birmingham. Willie Ray, who was lighter-skinned, was placed through a different agency and sent to a white family in Huntsville. Different city, different agency, different world. The records were sealed. The files were kept separate. It was as if someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut the bond between these two brothers out of existence. No paper trail connecting them. No record that they were even related. Bessie Mee never recovered. She spent the next decade trying to get her boys back, filing paperwork she could barely read, showing up at offices where people told her to come back next week, next month, next year. She was a black woman in the Deep South in the 1960s fighting a system that had never been designed to help people who looked like her. She died in 1978 at the age of 39. Heart failure, the doctor wrote on the certificate. But everyone in Utah knew what really killed Bessie Mee Jenkins. She died of a broken heart. Willie Ray grew up in Huntsville with the Patterson family. Frank and Carol Patterson were good people. They raised Willie Ray alongside their 2 biological children, and they treated him like their own. He went to school. He played football. He graduated from high school and got a job at the post office where he would work for the next 37 years. The Pattersons loved him, and he loved them. But there was always something missing, a gap that no amount of love could fill. Willie Ray had exactly one memory of his brother. It was the memory of that day in 1964. He was standing in the front yard of his mother's house. A woman he did not know was holding his hand, and a car was pulling away from the curb with George Edward in the back seat. George Edward was pressing his face against the rear window. His mouth was open. He was screaming. Willie Ray could not hear what he was saying because the woman was pulling him in the opposite direction, toward a different car. But he could see his brother's face. And that face, twisted with fear and confusion and something that a 6-year-old should never have to feel, stayed with Willie Ray for 60 years. He remembered one other thing. Just before the car pulled away, George Edward held up his hand, not waving, just holding it up, flat, like he was pressing it against the glass. Like he was trying to touch Willie Ray one more time through the window. Willie Ray reached out his hand too, but the car was already moving, and that was the last time Willie Ray Jenkins saw his brother. The Pattersons told Willie Ray that he had a brother somewhere, but they did not know where. The adoption records were sealed. The agency that had handled Willie Ray's placement had different files than the agency that handled George Edwards. In the 1960s South, these systems did not talk to each other. They were barely functioning in the first place, and for black families, they functioned even less. Willie Ray started searching for George Edward when he was 18 years old. He went to the county courthouse in Utah and asked to see his records. The clerk looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. He went to the agency in Huntsville that had handled his adoption. They said the records were sealed and could not be opened without a court order. He went to a judge. The judge said no. Went to another judge, same answer. He hired a lawyer when he was 30 years old using money he had saved from the post office. The lawyer found fragments, a first name, a birth year, and the name of the agency that had placed George Edward. But the agency had closed in 1979. The files had been transferred to the state archives, where they sat in boxes in a basement that flooded in 1992, destroying thousands of records. Every lead was a dead end. Every door was locked. Every answer was, "I am sorry, we cannot help you." For 60 years, Willie Ray Jenkins looked for his brother. He put notices in newspapers. He registered on adoption reunion websites. He sent his DNA to 3 different genetic testing companies. Nothing came back. George Edward Jenkins had been swallowed by a system that had never cared about keeping 2 black brothers together in the first place. Willie Ray was married for 35 years to a woman named Lucille, a church organist who understood her husband's grief without needing him to explain it every day. They had 3 children together, twins named Marcus and Monique, and a younger son named DeAndre. Lucille was the one who kept Willie Ray from losing himself completely in the search. She would find him at 2 in the morning sitting at the computer, scrolling through databases and reunion registries with bloodshot eyes, and she would put her hand on his shoulder and say, "He is out there, baby, but you need to be alive when he finds you. Come to bed." Willie Ray retired from the post office at 60 years old. At his retirement party, his coworkers gave him a plaque and a handshake and asked him what he planned to do with all his free time. Willie Ray said, "I am going to find my brother." Nobody laughed because everybody who knew Willie Ray knew he was not joking. It was his daughter Monique who changed everything. Monique was 34 years old and worked as a data analyst at a tech company in Atlanta. She was good at finding things. It was literally her job, and for the past 2 years she had been doing something her father did not know about. She had been using every tool available to her: DNA databases, genealogical records, state archives that had been digitized since the flood, social media algorithms, and a network of amateur genealogists who specialized in reuniting black families separated by the foster care system of the Jim Crow South. 3 months before the Family Feud taping, Monique found him, George Edward Jenkins. Now going by the name George Edward Lawson, the surname of the family that had adopted him in Birmingham. He was 66 years old. He had worked as a bus driver for the city of Birmingham for 32 years before retiring. He had a wife named Dorothy. He had 4 children, and he had been searching for his little brother for almost as long as Willie Ray had been searching for him. Monique called George Edward on a Tuesday evening. The conversation lasted 3 hours. George Edward cried for the first 40 minutes straight. When he could finally speak, the first thing he said was, "Does he remember me? Does Willie Ray remember me?" Monique said, "Daddy remembers you pressing your hand against the car window. He has thought about it every single day of his life." George Edward broke down again. "I was trying to touch him," he said through his tears. "I was trying to reach him one more time. I have never forgiven myself for not getting out of that car." Monique knew she had to do something bigger than a phone call to bring these brothers together. A reunion like this, 60 years in the making, deserved a moment worthy of the wait. So she contacted Family Feud. She told the producers the story. And the producers, who had orchestrated emotional moments on the show before, said this was something they had never encountered. 60 years. Brothers who had never known each other as adults. A system that had deliberately erased their connection. This was not just a reunion. This was a reckoning. Monique put together the family team for the show: Willie Ray, herself, her twin brother Marcus, her younger brother DeAndre, and Lucille. She told her father they were going on Family Feud as a fun retirement activity. Willie Ray agreed because Lucille told him to, and because 37 years of marriage had taught him that agreeing with Lucille was always the right decision. He had no idea what was actually about to happen. The Jenkins family stood on the Family Feud stage looking like a family that had been through some things but had come out the other side together. Willie Ray was at the front, 63 years old, stocky and strong, with gray at his temples and hands that were thick from decades of sorting mail and fixing things around the house. He wore a dark brown suit that Lucille had picked out and a gold tie pin that had been a retirement gift from the post office. Lucille stood beside him in a deep purple dress, elegant and calm, her hand resting lightly on his back. Behind them were Marcus, Monique, and DeAndre. Marcus was big like his father. Monique was sharp-eyed and alert, scanning the stage like someone who knew something nobody else knew. DeAndre was the youngest and the loosest, bouncing on his toes and grinning at the cameras. They were up against the Fitzgerald family from Charlotte, North Carolina, a group of sisters who were funny, fast, and clearly there to win. The Fitzgeralds were good television. They cracked jokes, they hugged after every answer, and they had matching outfits that the audience loved. Steve Harvey came out and worked the room with his usual energy. When he got to Willie Ray, he shook his hand and immediately noticed something. "Now that is a firm handshake, sir. Postal worker." Willie Ray blinked. "Retired." "How did you know?" Steve grinned. "I can always tell. Postal workers and mechanics, strongest handshakes in America. How long did you carry mail?" 37 years, same route for the last 20. "Same route for 20 years. The people on that route must miss you." Willie Ray smiled. It was a gentle smile, the kind that suggested a man who was used to being steady and quiet and doing his job without fanfare. "They gave me a cake on my last day, German chocolate, my favorite." The audience laughed warmly. Steve moved on to the rest of the family, chatting with Lucille and the kids, but Monique noticed that Steve spent an extra moment looking at Willie Ray. The producers had briefed Steve. He knew what was coming, and for the first time all day, Steve Harvey was nervous. The game was competitive from the start. The Fitzgerald sisters were fast, but the Jenkins family was steady. Willie Ray was the anchor. He did not rush his answers. He thought about each one carefully, the way a man who had spent 37 years doing the same job the right way would think about anything. His answers were not flashy, but they were solid, and they were almost always on the board. During a break between rounds, Steve walked over to Willie Ray. The backstage cameras were rolling. "Willie Ray, tell me something about yourself that people might not know." Willie Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a brother I have never met." Steve leaned in. The studio seemed to get quieter even though no one had told the audience to be silent. They just felt it. "What do you mean you have never met him?" "We were separated when I was 3 years old. Foster care, Alabama, 1964. They split us up and they sealed the records. I have been looking for him for 45 years. Steve's face changed. He'd been briefed, but hearing Willie Ray say it out loud in that calm, steady voice with 60 years of pain packed into sentences that lasted no longer than a news headline hit differently. 45 years you have been searching?" "Yes, sir. His name is George Edward. He was 6 when they took him. I was 3. I remember his face in the back window of the car. That is the only memory I have of my brother." The audience was completely silent now. A woman in the third row was already crying. Steve put his hand on Willie Ray's shoulder. "That is a long time to carry something like that." Willie Ray nodded. "You get used to the weight, but you never stop feeling it." Steve held Willie Ray's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded almost to himself and walked back to his podium. Lucille squeezed Willie Ray's hand. Monique bit her lip and looked at the floor because she knew that in about 15 minutes her father's entire world was about to change. The Jenkins family won the game. It came down to a steal in the final round, and it was Willie Ray who delivered the winning answer. The question was, name something you would never throw away no matter how old it gets. Without even pausing, Willie Ray said, "A photograph." Number 2 answer, but it was enough. The steal was good and the Jenkins family was going to fast money. During the transition, a backstage camera caught Monique pulling Marcus and DeAndre into a huddle. "It is happening after fast money," she whispered. "George Edward has been backstage since 10 o'clock this morning. He is a nervous wreck, but he is ready. When Steve gives the signal, just be ready to catch Daddy. He is not going to be able to stand." Marcus nodded. His eyes were already red. DeAndre was bouncing harder than before, but not from excitement. From the effort of keeping the biggest secret of his life from a father he had never once lied to. Lucille stood apart from the group, watching Willie Ray from across the stage. He was standing by himself near the podium, straightening his tie pin, completely unaware. She pressed her hand to her heart and whispered something no microphone picked up. But if you read her lips, it looked like she said, "Almost there, baby." The producer asked Willie Ray casually what $20,000 would mean to him. Willie Ray thought about it and said, "I would put it toward finding my brother. I have spent money on lawyers and investigators over the years, but I have never had enough to really do a proper search. $20,000 might be enough to finally find him." The producer nodded and walked away. Then she went behind the set and cried for 2 minutes because she knew that Willie Ray's brother was standing 40 feet from him at that exact moment. Fast money. DeAndre went first and played well, scoring 128 points. That left Willie Ray needing 72 points. A challenging number, but absolutely within reach. Willie Ray took his place at the podium. Steve looked at him. "Willie Ray, you need 72 points. Your boy gave you a solid start. How are you feeling?" Willie Ray touched his tie pin. "I am feeling blessed, Mr. Harvey. No matter what happens, I got my family here with me. That is enough." Steve nodded. 20 seconds on the clock. Here we go. Name the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning. Family. Name something that never changes no matter how much time passes. A mother's love. How many chances should you give someone? As many as it takes. Name something a child should never lose. Hope. Name the one thing you would say to someone you have not seen in a very long time. Willie Ray paused, just for a heartbeat. And then, in a voice so steady and so certain it could have been carved in stone, he said, "I have been looking for you." The buzzer sounded. Willie Ray did not move. He stood there with his hands on the podium and his eyes staring straight ahead like a man who had just laid every card he had on the table and was waiting to see if the universe would finally deal him a fair hand. Beat 5, Community Awareness. Steve began the reveal. His voice was careful, measured. He was a man walking through a moment he knew was about to become something much bigger. "You said family for the first thing you think about in the morning." Number 1 answer, 43 points. The audience clapped. Willie Ray was already past the 200 mark with DeAndre's score. He had won. "A mother's love for something that never changes." Number 1 answer, 37 points. Steve paused and repeated the answer to himself quietly. "A mother's love. As many as it takes for how many chances you should give someone." Number 2 answer, 18 points. "Hope for something a child should never lose." Number 1 answer, 39 points. Steve shook his head slowly. 4 answers and 3 of them were number 1s. "And for the one thing you would say to someone you have not seen in a very long time, you said, 'I have been looking for you.'" Steve stopped. He set his cue card down on the podium. He looked at the board. Number 1 answer. 42 points. Final total, 307 points. 4 out of 5 number 1 answers. An incredible score. But nobody was looking at the numbers. Because Willie Ray Jenkins, the retired postal worker who had spent 60 years searching for his brother, had just answered 5 questions on a game show, and every single answer was a love letter to the person he had been missing his entire life. Willie Ray lowered his head. He did not cry. Not yet. He just stood there with his forehead resting on his hands, breathing slowly like a man who had just finished a very long race. Lucille came to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind and pressed her face into his back. Marcus put his hand on his father's shoulder. DeAndre stood behind them all, his face crumbling. Monique stood apart, trembling, watching, waiting, because she knew the race was not over yet. Steve walked over to Willie Ray. He did not rush. He moved the way you move in a hospital room or a church, slowly, respectfully, like the ground itself was sacred. "Willie Ray, can you look at me?" Willie Ray lifted his head. His eyes were dry but heavy. 60 years of searching had left him with a face that had learned not to expect good news. "Willie Ray, you told me during the break that you have been looking for your brother for 45 years. "Yes, sir." "Told me that the last time you saw him, he was pressing his hand against the window of a car. You were 3 years old, he was 6. "Yes, sir. I have seen that moment every night when I close my eyes, every single night for 60 years. Steve swallowed hard. His eyes were already filling. "Willie Ray, your daughter Monique is a very special young woman." Willie Ray looked at Monique, confused. Monique was crying silently, both hands pressed over her mouth. 3 months ago, Monique found something. She used her skills, her resources, and her love for you to do something that courts and lawyers and agencies and 45 years of searching could not do. Willie Ray's body went still. The kind of still that happens when every cell in your body knows something your brain has not caught up to yet. "Willie Ray, your brother George Edward is alive. He lives in Birmingham, Alabama. He is 66 years old. He is a retired bus driver. He has a wife named Dorothy and 4 children." Steve's voice was barely holding. "And Willie Ray, he has been looking for you too, for just as long." Willie Ray made no sound. He stared at Steve like the words were falling from very far away and had not landed yet. His mouth opened slightly. His hands, which had been resting on the podium, began to shake. "George Edward is here, Willie Ray. He is backstage. He has been here all day, and he wants to see his little brother for the first time in 60 years. Willie Ray's legs buckled. Marcus caught him. Lucille caught him. They held him upright the way pillars hold up a roof. "Where?" Willie Ray said, just one word, barely a whisper, but it contained everything. 60 years of searching, 60 years of wondering, 60 years of reaching toward a car window. "Where is he?" Steve was crying now, not the subtle, camera-ready kind of crying, the real kind, the kind where your nose runs and your voice breaks and your body shakes. Steve Harvey, the man who had built a career on composure and comedy, was falling apart on his own stage, and he did not care. "Turn around, Willie Ray." Willie Ray turned. At the back of the stage stood a man. He was 66 years old, slightly taller than Willie Ray, with the same broad forehead and the same deep-set eyes. His hair was completely white. He was wearing a black suit and a blue tie that his wife Dorothy had knotted for him that morning because his hands were shaking too badly to do it himself. He had been standing backstage since 10 in the morning, watching his brother on a monitor, watching a man he had not seen since 1964 play a game show and talk about looking for him and answer questions that might as well have been written for the two of them. George Edward Lawson, born George Edward Jenkins. The 6-year-old boy in the back of the car, the boy who had pressed his hand against the window, the boy who had spent 60 years trying to reach his little brother one more time. And now he was standing 30 feet away and Willie Ray was looking at him. Neither man moved at first. They just stared. 60 years of absence does not dissolve in an instant. It takes a moment for the brain to catch up with what the heart already knows. Willie Ray's face went through a dozen expressions in about 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. And then something that is beyond words, something that does not have a name in English or any other language. The face of a man seeing the living answer to a question he had been asking God for 6 decades. George Edward moved first. He took one step forward and raised his hand, flat, palm out. The same gesture he had made through the car window in 1964. Willie Ray saw it, and the sound that came out of him was unlike anything anyone in that studio had ever heard. It was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was a moan that seemed to come up from the floor through his feet and out of his mouth, carrying with it 60 years of loneliness, 60 years of questions, 60 years of reaching toward a car window and never quite making contact. Willie Ray raised his own hand, flat, palm out, the mirror image of his brother, and then they ran. Two men in their 60s running across a game show stage like they were children again, running toward each other the way they should have been allowed to run toward each other in 1964 if the world had not failed them. George Edward was limping because his right knee was bad. Willie Ray was stumbling because he could barely see through his tears, but neither of them stopped. They met in the center of the stage. George Edward grabbed Willie Ray by the shoulders, and Willie Ray grabbed George Edward by the arms, and they pulled each other in so hard and so fast that the impact actually made a sound through the microphones. And then they held on. They held on like two halves of something that had been broken for 60 years and finally snapped back together. "Little brother," George Edward said. His voice was high and broken and soaked in tears. "I have been trying to reach you since 1964. I have been trying to reach you since I was 6 years old." "I know," Willie Ray said. "I know, I was reaching too, I was reaching back." George Edward pulled away just enough to look at Willie Ray's face. He studied it the way you study a map when you are trying to find your way home. He touched Willie Ray's forehead, his cheek, his jaw. He was memorizing a face he had last seen on a 3-year-old boy standing in a front yard in Udall, Alabama. "You look like Mama," George Edward said. Willie Ray broke. That was the word that undid him. Mama, because he did not remember Bessie Me. He had been too young when they were separated. He had no memories of his mother at all. He had spent his entire life knowing he had a mother who loved him, but having no memory of her face, her voice, or her touch. And now his brother, the only other person on earth who shared that connection, was standing in front of him saying that he looked like her. "Tell me about her," Willie Ray said through his sobs. "Please. Tell me about Mama." George Edward held his brother's face in both hands. "She was beautiful. She sang in the morning. She smelled like soap and wood smoke. And she loved you, Willie Ray. She loved you so much that when they took us away, she fought them. She fought them in the yard. She fought them at the courthouse. She fought them until it killed her." Nobody in that studio was standing anymore. People had collapsed into their seats. People were holding strangers. People had their faces buried in their hands. The Fitzgerald family, who had been the opponents in the game, were huddled together, crying as hard as anyone else. Steve Harvey was not at his podium. He was sitting on the edge of the stage with his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. A producer came over and asked if he was okay. Steve shook his head. He could not speak. He later told an interviewer that this was the only time in his entire career when he physically could not continue, not because of unprofessionalism. Because his body simply would not stop crying. The families came together. Lucille met George Edward for the first time and hugged him and said, "I have been hearing about you for 35 years. Welcome home." Dorothy, George Edward's wife, met Willie Ray and held both his hands and said, "He has a picture of you as a baby in his wallet. He has carried it since the day he found it in his adoption file. It is the only picture of you he has." The children met their uncle and their cousins. Handshakes turned into hugs. Strangers became family in the span of minutes. After what must have been 10 minutes of tears and embraces, Steve Harvey finally made his way back to the podium. His face was a wreck. His tie was loosened. His eyes were swollen. He looked like a man who had just been through a war, which in a way he had. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve said, and his voice cracked so badly on the first word that he had to stop and start again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have hosted this show for many years. I have seen surprises, I have seen reunions, I have seen people win money and lose money and laugh and cry, but I have never in my entire life witnessed what I just witnessed." He took a breath. In 1964, the state of Alabama took two little boys from their mother and separated them. They sealed the records, they erased the connection. They decided that these brothers did not matter enough to keep together. 60 years. These two men have been searching for each other for 60 years. And today, on this stage, in front of all of you and everyone watching at home, that 60-year injustice has been corrected. Steve turned to Willie Ray and George Edward, who were standing side by side, shoulders touching, unwilling to be more than an inch apart. "Willie Ray, George Edward, I want you to know that everyone in this building, and everyone who will ever watch this clip, is standing with you. What was done to your family was wrong. It was a crime against two little boys and a mother who deserved better. But you survived it, both of you. You survived it and you never stopped looking, and that is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The ovation was the longest in the history of the show. It was not just applause, it was a reckoning. It was hundreds of people standing on their feet and acknowledging that something broken had been made whole. When the episode aired, the response was seismic. The clip was viewed over 150 million times in the first 2 weeks, making it the most watched Family Feud clip of all time. Every major news network covered the story. International outlets picked it up in more than 30 countries. The hashtag, 60 years, trended worldwide for 4 consecutive days. People were sharing it with messages that ranged from simple grief to righteous anger about the systems that had separated families like the Jenkins brothers. But the impact went far beyond viral numbers. The story of Willie Ray and George Edward became a catalyst for a national conversation about the foster care system, particularly its history of separating black families in the American South. Historians and journalists began investigating the agency practices of the 1950s and 1960s, uncovering patterns of deliberate separation that went far beyond the Jenkins case. Civil rights organizations used the story to push for legislation that would make it easier for adults to access their sealed adoption and foster care records. Within 6 months of the episode airing, 3 states passed laws loosening the restrictions on sealed foster care records for adults seeking to reconnect with biological siblings. The legislation was informally called the Jenkins Act, though it never became official. Advocates said the story of Willie Ray and George Edward had done more to advance the cause in 6 months than decades of lobbying had accomplished. Willie Ray and George Edward spent the first week after the reunion at Willie Ray's house in Tuscaloosa. They did not leave the house for 4 days. They sat at the kitchen table and talked for hours at a time. George Edward told Willie Ray everything he remembered about Bessie Mee, what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, how she hummed gospel songs while she cooked, how she braided the collard greens into the chicken broth the way their grandmother had taught her. Small details that meant nothing to anyone else but meant the world to a man who had no memories of his own mother. George Edward brought photographs. He had 3 pictures of Bessie Mee that he had carried for decades. They were small, creased, and faded, but they were real. Willie Ray held those photographs and stared at them for so long that Lucille eventually had to gently take them from his hands so he would eat dinner. The next morning, Lucille had the photos professionally restored and framed. They hung in the Jenkins living room from that day forward, above the couch, where Bessie Mee could watch over her boys the way she had always wanted to. The brothers also visited Utah together. They drove down on a Saturday morning and found the lot where their mother's shotgun house had stood. The house was gone, replaced by an empty field with knee-high grass, but the oak tree in the front yard was still there, enormous now with branches that reached over the road. They stood under that tree together, 2 men in their 60s, and George Edward said, "This is where we were standing. You were right there." He pointed to a spot near the road. "And I was in the car, right there." Willie Ray put his hand on the trunk of the tree. "I am here now," he said. "We are both here now." They went to Bessie Mee's grave next. She was buried in a small cemetery behind a Baptist church. The headstone was simple and weather-worn. It read, "Bessie Mee Jenkins, 1939-1978, beloved mother." The brothers stood at the grave together, and George Edward spoke to their mother for both of them. "Mama, your boys found each other. Took 60 years, but we found each other. And we are not ever letting go again. You rest now, Mama. We are okay." Willie Ray could not speak. He just nodded and wept and held his brother's hand. Steve Harvey visited the brothers 3 months after the episode. He met them at Willie Ray's house, sat at the kitchen table where they had spent those first days together, and had a conversation that aired as a special segment on his show. How are you adjusting to having a brother after 60 years? You've asked? George Edward laughed. He snores and he takes too long in the bathroom, but I would not trade it for anything. Willie Ray shook his head. This man right here is the nosiest person I have ever met. He wants to know everything about my life. Everything. Every day it is a new question. Where did you go to school? Who was your first girlfriend? What kind of car did you drive in 1985? George Edward shrugged. I have 60 years to catch up on. That is a lot of questions. Steve smiled, but then he got serious. Willie Ray, what would you say to other families out there who are still separated, who are still searching? Willie Ray thought about it. He was not a man who rushed his answers, never had been. I would say do not let anyone tell you it is too late. They told me it was too late when I was 30. They told me it was too late when I was 40. They told me it was too late when I was 50. And then I was 63 years old and my daughter found my brother, and I was standing on a stage looking at the other half of my heart. It is never too late. Never. The brothers saw each other almost every weekend after the reunion. Birmingham to Tuscaloosa was only an hour drive, and they took turns making the trip. George Edward would come on Saturdays and sit in Willie Ray's garage while Willie Ray tinkered with old radios, a hobby he had picked up in retirement. Willie Ray would drive to Birmingham on Sundays for dinner at George Edward and Dorothy's house, where Dorothy made sweet potato pie that Willie Ray said was the best thing he had ever eaten, a statement that caused Lucille to give him a very specific look across the table. Their children and grandchildren became inseparable. The Jenkins-Lawson family, as they began calling themselves, held their first combined family reunion 1 year after the episode. Over 70 people attended. There were people who shared DNA that had never been in the same room before. Cousins meeting cousins, nieces meeting uncles, children meeting the branches of a family tree that had been hidden from them by a system that never should have had the power to hide it. At that reunion, the family planted a tree, a young oak. George Edward had brought a seedling from the old oak in Utah, the tree that had been standing in the yard the day they were separated. They planted it in Willie Ray's backyard in Tuscaloosa, and George Edward said a prayer over it. This tree comes from the place where we were torn apart. We are planting it in the place where we came back together. Let it grow. Let it remind our children and their children that roots cannot be destroyed. They can be buried. They can be hidden, but they always find their way back to the surface. 2 years after the reunion, Monique, the daughter whose research skills had started it all, quit her corporate job and started a nonprofit called Found Family. The organization used data analytics, DNA matching, and genealogical research to reunite black families that had been separated by the foster care system in the South between 1940 and 1980. In its first year, Found Family reunited 14 sibling groups. By the third year, that number had grown to over 60. Monique said the same thing every time she was interviewed about the organization. My father spent 45 years looking for his brother with outdated tools and locked doors. I had the right tools and the right training. The least I could do was use them. Nobody should have to search for 60 years to find the person they were taken from. Willie Ray and George Edward were together for 6 more years before George Edward passed away peacefully at the age of 72. He died at home in Birmingham with Dorothy at his side and Willie Ray holding his hand. It was the first time the brothers had held hands since 1964, and this time, nobody separated them. Willie Ray stayed until the end. At George Edward's funeral, Willie Ray stood at the front of the church and spoke to a room full of 400 people. His voice was steady the way it had always been, but his eyes were wet. I got 6 years with my brother, he said. Most people would say that is not enough, and they are right, it is not enough. 60 years was stolen from us, but I will tell you something. Those 6 years were the most complete years of my life. For the first time, I was not searching anymore. I was not missing someone. I was not reaching toward a window. I was home. My brother gave me that. And nobody and nothing can take it from me. He paused. George Edward, I know you are listening. I know you are with Mama now. And I know the first thing she did when she saw you was grab your face and look at you the way she used to. Tell her that her little boy found his way. Tell her that both her boys found their way. And tell her we will all be together again someday. But until then, I will keep reaching for you, just like I always have. The young oak tree in Willie Ray's backyard grew strong. Its branches spread wide. The grandchildren played under it. The family gathered around it every year for the reunion. And every time Willie Ray sat beneath its shade, he touched the bark the way he had touched the tree in Utah, and he felt his brother's presence. Not gone, just ahead of him. Waiting. The way George Edward had always been waiting. Since the day a car pulled away from a shotgun house and a 6-year-old boy pressed his hand against the glass and refused to stop reaching for the brother he loved. If this story moved something inside of you, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with your brother, share it with your sister, share it with anyone who knows what it means to miss someone so deeply it becomes part of who you are. Drop a comment below and tell me, who is the person you have been reaching for? I read every single comment, and your stories are what make this channel worth running. Until next time, never stop reaching. God bless.